Hello, happy Tuesday. Today I want to talk about finally get to rhetorical analysis, which is the most important material that we'll go over for the semester because you'll be asked to write 2 rhetorical analyses. But before I get to that, I just wanted to mention to you all that to keep up with your blogs. Participation was very good the first 2 weeks, not so much this past week. I gave you an extra day until Saturday, and only 6 of you have participated so far. Do remember that the blog posts are worth 15% of your grade and can drop you a letter grade, okay? So it's very important that you finish those. Now, having said that, I will give you credit for late work all the way up to the end of the semester. If you are struggling to keep up with the discussion forum, okay? I know that this is a crazy time, lots of stress and anxiety, and dealing with a lot of changes, and it's a scary time. So I am not going to make it in the settings where you can't edit your blog post once the due date has passed. You can continue to edit any blog post and add any blog post up until the end of the semester, okay? So turn in something because late points are better than nothing. And if you don't have any of that 15% credit, it can drop you, a letter grade and a half, okay? So do keep up with your discussion blogs. Go back and catch up on that. Try hard to do that this week, okay? It concerns me quite a bit, all right? Those discussion blogs are really important because this is a discussion-based class and we're not able to have discussions face-to-face because of COVID. So that makes the discussion forum even more important. And it is, again, 15% of your grade, okay? All right. Before we begin, at the end of the last week's lecture, I went over rhetorical devices. So I want to spend just a couple minutes going over a little bit more information on rhetorical devices. Oh, and also hopefully this week during my video, I won't knock my phone over and my dogs will not go crazy barking at people walking around in other apartments. So hopefully you won't hear my dog barking and I won't knock the camera down. No promises though, we'll try. Okay, so rhetorical devices. Now, like I said, you're going to be familiar with a lot of rhetorical devices. I believe I posted a list of rhetorical devices. If not, I will post both of those lists today. I have a list of 2 pretty extensive, long lists of rhetorical devices that I'll post today. I don't think I did post them last week. So take a look at those. And because you want to be able to identify rhetorical devices that the author is using. That's one of the purposes of a rhetorical analysis, is that you can identify the rhetorical devices the author is using and explain how they're using them, how the author is using them, okay? So rhetorical devices, metaphor, simile, analogy, all of those are rhetorical devices that you're already familiar with. There are a lot more that you're not familiar with. Again, there's not going to be a quiz. You don't have to memorize all of these, but familiarize yourself again. Review the ones that you already have been taught. To familiarize yourself with what they are again, so that you can identify them. At least some of the most common, okay? As I explained last time in the last lecture, rhetorical devices work at the word level, the sentence level, the paragraph level, and at the level of the entire composition, the entire essay. Rhetorical devices work in all of those capacities. The 5-paragraph structure is, as we talked about last week, one way that is a rhetorical device. That structure is a rhetorical device that works at the essay level, the composition level overall, okay? And then analogy would be something that, would work at the sentence level, right? Okay. Or an analogy could also work at the paragraph level or the essay level, because depending on how long you carry out that analogy, right? If the entire essay is an analogy comparing two things, then that is a rhetorical device that works at the essay level, at the composition level. All right? So rhetorical devices can work at the word level, sentence level, paragraph level, and at the level of the entire structure of the essay. All right? Now, let's go back. I just want to quickly review some that are very common and talk a little bit more about how rhetorical devices work before we jump into analyzing rhetorical devices and identifying them. Okay. So, each of these rhetorical devices is going to function to make an appeal. And the three appeals you can make are ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethics, logic, and emotion. Ethos, ethics, logos, logic, pathos, emotion, right? You can make appeals to the audience's emotion. You can make appeals to the audience's sense of logic. And you can make appeals to the audience's sense of ethics by establishing your credibility or making an appeal towards the audience's sense of morality. Okay? So, there are sonic devices, sonic rhetorical devices that depend on sound. One of those is alliteration, the repetition of a sound of an initial consonant or consonant cluster in subsequent syllables. And then assonance is the same thing, but vowel sounds instead of consonant sounds. Now, what kind of effect would that have on the audience? The repetition of a single sound, not the repetition of a word, but the repetition of a single sound. Think about what kind of effect that would have on the audience, right? And this is mostly used in poetry, okay? So these sonic devices mostly you find in poetry, all right? But that's how they work, is the repetition of sounds. Word repetition. Word repetition, rhetorical devices operate via repeating words or phrases in various ways, usually for emphasis. And I want to make a point about emphasis that sometimes gets lost when I teach this class. When we talk about the rhetorical device, repetition. Repetition is a rhetorical device, and there are rhetorical devices that work through repetition, if that makes sense. Okay? One of them being the repetition of certain phrases or certain words even. So one that you may or may not be familiar with that works this way, rhetorical device, is called anaphora. An anaphora is simply repeating the same word at the beginning of different sentences, phrases, or clauses. So it's starting several successive sentences with the same word. Now, what effect would that have on the audience, right? Obviously, it emphasizes a point that the author is trying to communicate and get across clearly, right? But again, I wanted to make something clear about emphasis. Emphasis, anytime that repetition is used, it's because the author wants to emphasize a point. And you emphasize a point because you believe that it's important and because you want the audience to remember it, right? But why specifically does the author choose to repeat this specific phrase? Why is it important? Every time repetition is used, it is to emphasize a point. But how else is the repetition working? How else does this use of repetition affect the audience's understanding of the content, right? The author uses repetition to do more than just emphasize. Anytime it's used, it emphasizes, but be more a little specific about that, okay? So, word repetition. Then we have rhetorical devices that work in terms of word relation. Rhetorical devices that operate via deliberate connections between words within a sentence. An example of this would be an oxymoron. It is a two-word paradox, often achieved through the deliberate use of antonyms, two words that mean opposite things. This creates an internal contradiction that can have a rhetorical effect. It causes the audience to stop and think, those two things are opposite. How are they related? Why are they both appearing in the same sentence when they mean the opposite thing? So it has a sort of jarring effect that makes the audience pause. But it is based on the relation between these two words. They are those two words being opposites. Oxymoron and paradox. Okay? Then there are rhetorical devices that occur at the discourse level. One of these, let me define what that means first. Discourse level rhetorical devices rely on relations between phrases, clauses, and sentences instead of just words. So often they relate how new arguments are introduced into the text or how previous arguments are emphasized. And they include rhetorical devices such as amplification. Amplification involves repeating a word or expression while adding more detail to emphasize what might otherwise be passed over. This allows one to call attention to and expand a point to ensure the reader realizes its importance or centrality in the discussion. So amplification is really overemphasizing a point. Another might be hyperbole. Hyperbole is deliberate exaggeration that can be for literary effect. Deliberate over-exaggeration, sometimes this is humorous too. And then again, that raises the question, what kind of effect does humor have on the audience, right? And is humor appropriate given the subject matter that you're talking about? So speaking about repetition, we're all pretty familiar with, most likely, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So Martin Luther King keeps repeating I have a dream, and that clearly emphasizes the fact that Martin Luther King has a vision for the United States and its future, right? And the most important thing is he wants you to focus on that vision. So clearly the repetition of I have a dream emphasizes that. But it does more than just emphasize. That repetition in this instance also expands upon the idea of what Martin Luther King's dream is, in that every time Martin Luther King repeats this phrase, it gets bigger. I have a dream that, and he names several different locations in the United States. From the hills, from the mountain, Stonebriar Mountain in Georgia, from these different actual locations in the United States, so that eventually it covers the entire United States and eventually the world, right? So every time Martin Luther King keeps repeating that phrase, his dream encompasses more people and more places. And so more than just emphasizing his dream, the repetition of that phrase expands his dream. So that's what I want you to keep in mind, that repetition does more than emphasize. Don't stop there. Look for how else the repetition is functioning. I stop and say that specifically because repetition is one that's really commonly used. Okay? All right. So those are some examples of really common rhetorical devices. Another is irony. That's really, really commonly found. Again, there is not really a definitive difference between literary devices and rhetorical devices. They function in similar ways. But when you're looking at identifying rhetorical devices, you're looking at the effect the use of those words and phrases has on the audience. And if it's the intended effect that the author wanted those rhetorical devices to accomplish. So, if the author's trying to make their audience feel sad, feel emotion, does this rhetorical device work that way in this case? Or does it kind of miss the mark and have a different effect in the audience? Instead of arising sympathy in the audience, does the rhetorical device and the language that the author uses make the audience angry? Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Last, I'll speak a little bit about irony. Figure of speech where the speaker intends to express a meaning that is directly opposite of the said words. Now, I want to leave you with this to think about for next week. Why would anyone use irony? If you're trying to make it very clear what you mean, and irony is using words that mean the opposite of what is said, if you're trying to express something and you're using words that mean the exact opposite of what you're trying to express, why would an author make the choice to do that? Is the audience going to understand that the author is being ironic, right? If you're trying to clearly communicate a certain meaning, why would you use words that mean the exact opposite? How does that work in the audience? How is that effective or ineffective? What kind of situations is irony appropriate in? All right. So again, irony is the figure of speech or rhetorical device, and where the words of a speaker, the words of a speaker intends to express a meaning that is directly opposite of the said words. So the author uses words to express a meaning, but those words mean the opposite of the meaning they're intending to express. All right? The words of a speaker used intend to express a meaning that is directly opposite of the words that they're saying. Okay. Metaphor is another, and it connects two things to one another. So again, it relies on the relation between two different things that are most likely pretty opposite. Simile compares two different things that resemble each other in at least one way, and the hidden meaning lies in that one way in which they are similar. Okay, so those are some important rhetorical devices. Now we'll move on to analyzing how those rhetorical devices work and how authors use them and what effect those rhetorical devices have on the audience. All right? So what is rhetorical analysis? You all know what an essay is, what a cause and effect essay is, what a persuasive essay is, what a descriptive essay is. You're familiar with a lot of different genres. However, you probably have not been asked to write an essay like this, even though you've written an argumentative essay. This is different in important ways. You're not essentially making an argument. This is different in very important specific ways. Okay, so what is a rhetorical analysis? It's probably a genre that you're not really familiar with yet to this point in your career. First, I want to define what a rhetorical analysis is not, okay? It's not a summary of a literary work. In fact, when we're talking about rhetoric, we're normally talking about opinion pieces, journalism, speeches, politics, movies, and music, rather than literature, really. So it's not a summary of a literary work, but often rhetoric surrounds a social issue. Rhetoric arises out of a conversation surrounding a social issue, most often. That is the context in which we most often encounter it, especially during an election year, and especially less than a month before an election, like the time we are living in right now. Okay, so it's not an analysis or a summary of a literary work. Metaphor is a rhetorical device, but a rhetorical analysis is not asking you to analyze what this specific metaphor means in Hamlet, right? Shakespeare uses this metaphor in Hamlet and it means this. That is not what a rhetorical analysis is, okay? So that's the kind of essay that you're used to writing. That's the kind of analysis you're used to doing, all right? So that's what it's not. I don't want to see that, okay? Before, you might have analyzed Shakespeare's to be or not to be in Hamlet and trying to understand or make a meaning of the work, or even just a plain summary. That's not the work I'm asking you to do here, okay? That's the most common mistake that students make, is to analyze the meaning like they've always been taught to. Sort of literary analysis. But a rhetorical analysis is different from a literary analysis because we're separating form from content, all right? We're more concerned with the form, with the how, than the what. The content is the what's actually being said. The form is how it's communicated. A rhetorical analysis is analyzing how the author has communicated the message that they are communicating. They used humor here to this effect on their audience, right? Or they used metaphor here so that their audience would understand, would feel sorrow, would feel sadness, right? Or they used metaphor here so that their audience would really understand this point. Okay, so different from a literary analysis in that we separate form from content. We're interested in how the author chooses to communicate their message given their specific topic, given their intended audience, and given their specific time period and the situation that they're speaking in. All right? Not the meaning of the text, which is the content. We're separating form from content. Okay. So the most common mistake is doing sort of a literary analysis to help understand the meaning of a work. We're not doing that, all right? What a rhetorical analysis is, it requires you to apply your critical reading skills, which a couple weeks ago we spent quite a bit of time talking about critical reading skills, refreshing those critical reading skills. And it asks you, rhetorical analysis asks you to apply those critical reading skills in order to break down a text. Now, that's what analysis means, and that's the same thing that you're doing with literary analysis. Here's where it's different. The goal of a rhetorical analysis, again, is to articulate how the author writes rather than what they actually wrote. And I understand that this is going to take some practice, separating form from content. And so this is why you get 2 shots at a rhetorical analysis, because it is difficult. But I want you to focus on how the language is supposed to affect the audience. Why the author chose this specific phrase, this specific rhetorical device to communicate this idea. What effect did the author intend that rhetorical device to have on the audience? And does it work the way that the author wants it to? Okay? The goal of a rhetorical analysis is to articulate how the author writes rather than what they actually wrote. So we're going to kind of assume that you understand the meaning that the author is trying to get across, and that I understand the meaning is what the author is trying to get across. And we're past that step, and now we're looking at how did the author get their meaning across? How did they do that? What tools did they use? What rhetorical devices did they use to get their meaning across? And how effective are they at doing that job, at accomplishing their purpose? Remember that authors have a purpose for writing. So we analyze their use of rhetorical devices to determine how effective they were in accomplishing their purpose for writing. Okay? To do this, you'll analyze the strategies that an author uses to achieve his or her goal in writing their piece. Okay? So that's a lot of information. Let's break that down into some manageable parts. I'm going to give you questions at every step of your rhetorical analysis. Meaning, I've already given you a step-by-step on how to read an article that you're going to perform a critical analysis on, right? When we talked about critical reading skills, I gave you a step-by-step guide, what to do, how to read the essay that you're going to do a rhetorical analysis over, right? So now I'm going to give you steps on brainstorming, how to outline a rhetorical analysis. And then I'll give you steps on how to write each paragraph of the rhetorical analysis, and even steps on how to write a thesis for rhetorical analysis. But I'll give you steps on how to write the introduction, thesis introduction, body paragraphs, and conclusion specifically for rhetorical analysis. These are steps to ask as you're preparing to write a rhetorical analysis. And I've already given you the steps to ask as you're doing your critical reading before you even begin to think about doing a rhetorical analysis on an essay, how to read that essay first or article first, right? So I gave you those steps. Now we're on to the second part, which is thinking about outlining rhetorical analysis, okay? So, questions to ask yourself when you're rereading articles or sources and preparing to outline, create an outline and brainstorm for rhetorical analysis. What is the thesis? What is the overall argument? You guys are awesome at that. You guys have had so much practice and identifying the main idea, the main argument, the thesis, right? I would ask also that you identify it in each paragraph. There's a new argument being made in each paragraph. So be sure to do that too, okay? Okay. Question number 2. What did the author choose to write about and why? The author should make clear to you in their introduction why the topic that they chose matters to you and why it's important that they speak about it. So that question should not be hard to answer if the author has written their essay well, their argument well. Okay? Number 3, what is the writer's purpose? Choose an active verb here to get specific, all right? To inform, persuade, criticize, entertain, sometimes even. There are as many purposes that a writer can have as there are many writers in the world, okay? Who is the author's intended audience and how can you tell, right? How can you tell? Who's the author's intended audience and how can you tell? Is the author speaking to the... Are they writing to a younger audience? Are they writing to a female audience? Are they writing to a Christian audience? Who is their intended audience? Who is going to be receptive to what they have to say, receptive to their ideas? Okay, so who is their intended audience? Who are they trying to persuade? And how can you tell? How can you tell? Question number 5. How does the writer arrange his or her ideas? How the author arranges their ideas will affect how persuasive those ideas are and how well the audience understands what's being communicated. Okay, so how does the author arrange his or her ideas? Chronologically, and what other ways are there to arrange some ideas? So how does the author arrange their ideas? How does the writer use diction? That means word choice, arrangement, accuracy. Is it formal or informal? Technical versus slang language. What kind of language is used? What kind of word choice and how are those words arranged into phrases? Okay, that's what diction means. What gets repeated? What important words or phrases or terms or ideas get repeated? Okay, and why? What is the sentence structure of the text? That's along with diction and syntax. So along with diction, we've got syntax. So what is the sentence structure of the text? Are there fragments, run-ons, or is it more formal and correct? Is it declarative, exclamatory, imperative? What effect does this have? So if the author chooses to ask a bunch of questions, interrogative sentences, instead of making declarative sentences, and remember, declarative sentences are declaring a fact, declaring a statement, declaring something, stating it directly right out. And then imperative sentences, of course, are commanding someone to do something. So imagine the difference that you as a reader feel if the author is telling you what to do or if they're asking a bunch of rhetorical questions, right, that are meant to go unanswered but meant for you to think about. Again, rhetorical question is a rhetorical device that's very popular. A lot of authors use that to begin their essays, to begin their argument. So imagine the difference, the effect that interrogative sentences, questions, will have on you as compared to imperative sentences that are commanding you to do something. Okay, so what is the sentence structure of the text? Those are all questions that you can ask to help determine the rhetorical effect of of the author's use of language. Okay. Now, you want to answer those questions and you want to identify the rhetorical strategies the author uses. All right? You want to identify the rhetorical strategies that the author uses. Another, aside from identifying the rhetorical strategies that the author uses, you also want to identify, like I said, the audience, who the author is. So do a little bit of background, get a little bit of background information on the author to determine their perspective, their purpose, and the medium. Consider the medium too. Is it a written text? Is it a speech? Is it a television program? What is it? And context, of course. So the time and place surrounding the text. So you want to look very carefully when you're doing a rhetorical analysis. I mentioned the others before already. You want to determine who the intended audience is, who the author is, the author's purpose, and the medium that the text is delivered in. But you also want to identify the context. So look at how old the essay is. When was it written? Okay? And what time and place, right? What time and place was it originally written? And so the text needs to be analyzed within that context and then within the current context. Okay, but you need to understand that original historical context to analyze it in today's context. Okay? All right. Now, we've already established that rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So really, rhetorical analysis is to determine how persuasive the author actually is. And if they fail, where they failed. And if they succeeded, where they succeeded. Okay? So when you're asked to write a rhetorical analysis, you're really being asked to identify the particular strategies that the author uses to persuade or appeal. Now, I want to make an important distinction that students get a little hung up on. There are rhetorical devices and rhetorical appeals. Rhetorical devices, metaphor, analogy, anaphora, simile. Those, right? And rhetorical appeals are ethos, pathos, and logos. So rhetorical devices are used to make rhetorical appeals. All right? A rhetorical device like a metaphor might be used to appeal to emotion. Okay? The audience's sense of emotion. So we've got rhetorical devices that are used to make rhetorical appeals. Okay. Clarify that real quick. So in the rhetorical situation that we talked about within the second week of class, we've got the message, the writer, the speaker, and the audience. So I want you to keep those three elements in mind and identify those three elements as you begin your analysis. Okay? A rhetorical analysis paper asks you to identify who the speaker is, who the audience is, and what the message is, to determine how they work together. That is, what strategy is the author employing to communicate their message to the audience? What is the effect of these strategies on the audience? Is it the intended effect that the author had in mind? Do you find these strategies convincing for the author's given specific purpose and for their specific audience? They might be effective, but are they effective in this context, given this specific subject matter, and given this specific audience? Okay, so you've got to consider all of those things. That's what your analysis will be uncovering. So I've got questions here to help you identify if you're having trouble. What information do you need to know about the author? I've asked you to identify the author's purpose, who the author is, who the intended audience is, and what the message is, these parts of the rhetorical triangle. But what if you're having trouble identifying certain elements and placing the message in its original context? So I've got a list of questions. I'll also post these on Blackboard under course materials. I've got a list of questions to help you identify the elements of the rhetorical situation. Before you perform a rhetorical analysis, you need to identify the rhetorical situation, identify the rhetorical devices being used, and identify the 3 elements of the rhetorical triangle. Okay, speaker, audience, and message. All right, so let's start with the speaker. How does the author present him or herself? Remember that ethos is the author's credibility. How does the author present him or herself? Is the author familiar with their subject? Are they knowledgeable enough to speak about the subject? How can you tell? What language specifically clues you into the fact that they know what they're talking about and that they're a credible authority? How does the author show good judgment or a broad perspective? How does the author accommodate the opposition? How does the author anticipate the opposition? Arguments that could be made against them. How do they counter them? How do they counter the opposition? Do they treat the opposition fairly? Is the author reasonable? How can you tell? Often in really inflammatory language, illogical language, would indicate that the author is not being reasonable. They are too angry, too emotionally involved, too close to the subject to speak rationally or logically about it, and they're becoming angry, and it becomes more of a tirade than a logical argument, right? So look for inflammatory language. That's one way to tell that the author is not being reasonable. How does the author treat the reader? Do they treat the reader as though the reader is one of their peers and an intelligent person, an intelligent and reasonable person? Or do they treat the reader with contempt, like the reader is stupider than they are? Not a great strategy rhetorically to do that, but you do see it. It happens. Authors can take a very conceited tone, a very condescending tone. That's the word I was looking for. Okay? How does the author treat those who disagree, the opposition? How does the author value others' welfare? Or do they only argue for the position that best benefits and suits them instead of the needs of others? How does the author use stereotypes or show prejudice? Everyone has biases just because it's the nature of being human and our limited perspective. So what biases does the author have? And do they recognize those biases? Okay. Where was this published? What does this show about the work? Different publications. BuzzFeed is known for being, extremely liberal and not concerned with being super factual. Whereas Fox News, for example, is completely on the opposite spectrum. Very conservative publication. So where this was published matters. For your specific purposes on this close reading that you just turned in, the publication was from an academic publisher. So you can guarantee that it has been peer-reviewed and fact-checked, because academic publications go through a rigorous fact-checking peer review process. Okay? So any publication that comes from an academic press, you can trust that before it was released, it had been peer-reviewed. Whereas the peer review process for journalism and mainstream news is less rigorous. Okay. Next. The audience. Okay, the audience. What are the characteristics of the audience? How can you tell? Characteristics meaning all things that I want you to consider. Ethnicity, citizenship, location in the world, religious affiliations or level of education, economic level or status, economic status, race, age, sex, physical characteristics, habits, sexual orientation, of course. Consider all of those characteristics about the audience and the author. Is the reader or audience encouraged to have an emotional response to the writing? How can you tell? How should the audience use the information about opposing views? The author will give the audience information about the opposing views. What should the audience do with that information? Is the reader encouraged to examine or question the opposition's motives? What reader needs, values, and beliefs are presented here? How can you tell? So how has the author considered what the audience needs, values, and believes? Okay? And has the author provided those things and been sensitive to the audience's beliefs and values? Is there a pattern to word choice or word order? Look for patterns. Is the language simple or complex? Are the terms that they're arguing defined, well defined? What is the style of this work? How is the style created? Does the style of this piece resemble that of any other works? So again, how are the thoughts and ideas structured? So that the audience will understand. What imagery is used? Emphasis, repetition, rhythm, analogy, metaphor, simile. So how are those rhetorical devices, how does the author use those rhetorical devices to impact the audience? The message, the actual text. How is the actual text organized? What are the cues to this organization? What organizational strategy have they used? Meaning, narrative strategy, comparison, contrast to make their argument, division, classification to make their argument, cause and effect, definition and description. There are different ways to organize your argument and classify your argument. And those are just 5 that I mentioned there. Comparison, contrast, you're probably pretty familiar with. But how has the author presented and organized their argument? Okay? And I'll provide a list of the different kinds of arguments that can be made, those different categories. Those are most of them. Comparison, contrast, division, classification, cause and effect. Most of the kinds of arguments that you can make. But I'll provide a list with a few more. Okay? On Blackboard under course materials. What claims are made? Are these claims strong, obvious claims? Claims that anyone would come up with? Or is it a more original argument? What evidence is used to support the claim? Examples and illustrations, facts, statistic, laws, memories or records, or expert or witness testimony or opinion. How does the work look? Is it organized neatly? Is it laid out neatly? The layout well organized and clear? Or do the font sizes seem appropriate and easy for the reader to read? So you want to also pay attention to what it actually looks like, because that will affect how the reader understands what's being said. Okay? All right. So next week I will go over how to put together, how to outline and actually write your rhetorical analysis. But for now, that's what a rhetorical analysis is. Always let me know if you have any questions. But next week we'll go over how to actually write your rhetorical analysis, because before we know it, those will be due. Your first rhetorical analysis would be due, and that will be coming up. All right. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you all next week.